Welcome to the Rooted Healing podcast, where we seek to deepen our kinship with the living landscapes around us and within us. This is a space where stories heal with words that weave us closer to our wild and interrelational nature, where we explore ways to root down intimately with the land, ecosystems, communities, and practices that help us heal, reimagine, and co-create the world we remember to belong in.
Our expression has been stolen from us, and we are an expression of nature. The way that we tend, the way that we get back to that, the way that we honour that is tending to the wild within us.
An overflowing summer has resulted in the podcast taking a breather, but there are many delightful episodes patiently waiting to meet your ears and many more interviews to come, so thank you for bearing with me. I'd love to introduce you to Hayley Francis, who is a poet and poetry therapist from Birmingham. Her debut collection, Administer the Laughing Gas, with Verve Poetry Press, collects a navigation of grief and re-encountering life post-trauma. Each poem is an unfiltered documentation of a bereaved mother's survival, presenting ethereal realizations of birth trauma, grief, body autonomy, and ritual. In 2004, Hayley was appointed the first poet in residence for Birmingham Women's and Children's Hospital. Her work explores the psychology of creative writing and its potential as a therapeutic medium. Hayley is Assistant Director for Verve Poetry Festival and co-founder of The Collective, a development initiative for rising poets. She was awarded an ACE project grant to run The Right Words, a therapeutic poetry project in partnership with Bedlam Mental Health Festival and Birmingham and Solihull Mental Health Trust, resulting in the curation of an artistic development program that laid the groundwork for a future in poetry therapy. In her current role as resident poet in rehabilitation settings, she leads poetry workshops within 12-week rehabilitation programs for emotional and relational awareness. I have deep respect for her devotion to this path, and having woven in creative writing practices into our gatherings for some years, I've tasted the potency of embodied writing in group settings in the circle. And my intention with this episode is to inspire more creative therapies and to inspire your inner wild experience to be expressed, not only for yourself, but for others to experience themselves through your expression. Hayley shares intimately about her losses, her grief, and her insights from the Earth Medicine grief tending retreat she attended with us earlier this year. I recently held space together again with Nikki of the Grief Space, this time at Earth Barton in Cornwall, where two rivers snake around and join into one, forming the feeling of inhabiting an island, with a crumbling, humble 12th century chapel above an ancient stone mill. And this space of praise, sorrow, and joy that, surrounded by such expansive water and liminal lands, surely predates the Normans. We felt pagan roots. And I reflected that the rawness and bareness of grief makes it wild, untamable, alive. It cannot be moulded to a monoculture. As Francis Weller says, grief resists the demands to remain passive and still. Welcoming grief is one of the keys to welcoming our own wildness. Grief brings us up against the edge of full aliveness. It ripens us. It stretches our experience into wider landscapes and composts the noise of the overculture. And through the cracks of the broken concrete, seeds germinate, flora rises, life fills itself anew. In this sense, grief makes us good soil for whatever is coming next. And this little snippet from one of Laura Weaver's poem comes to mind here. This life depends on rupture, thrives in places where edges meet, and yet so often we want to curl into the comfort of the static, as if this would save us from being part of everything, as if this would save us from the torrent of time carving us into new shapes we have never seen before. Nikki spoke about this in the first ever episode of this podcast, that the words for grief and praise are the same in the Tutsi language because you can only grieve what you have dearly loved. And perhaps this works in the other direction too. If we do not grieve in modern society, we lose our capacity for praise and love. A numbed heart loses its connection within the family of things. To tend to our grief is to reclaim a wild reverence for this existence in all its breadth and beauty. And there was also something radical about creating a grief ritual in an ancient chapel together, with an array of pillars and candles, flowers, and peaceful spaciousness. We could feel the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of human hearts stirring and tending in this place. And to reclaim a place of praise for all who long to sit at an altar of their grief, of their joy, to reclaim spaces of worship for all people of all creeds, feels really important. And as everyone, one by one, placed their items on the grief altar, tears flowed in what felt like one of the most beautiful honourings I have ever experienced. In those tears, I felt the sheer breadth of love the human heart is capable of. I was reminded of Cole Arthur Riley's quote, "Grief is an honouring." It really is. It's an honouring of your love, of life, of all that tears us open to the mysteries of this existence. And I will just weave this in to our online course, Deepen Your Roots, because this moves through the slow spiral of Joanna Macy's The Work That Reconnects, where we root in gratitude for the first few modules, but from there we tend to our grief for the world. And Joanna Macy said that in the face of impermanence and death, it takes courage to love the things of this world and to believe that praising them is our noblest calling. So if you are feeling affected by global, personal, social, ecological grief, know that it is an honouring, and seek spaces, circles of welcome to tend to what is stirring, because there's something really potent and alchemical that happens when we do this together. And moving through Macy's spiral for a whole year has shown us really clearly how needed grief tending is. Such depth has opened through this incredible group of people willing to really be with the emotions, be with the world. So registration is open as we call in next year's slow rooting ones. We truly believe in the potency of this work together. So if you're curious, head to rootedhealing.org/deepen to learn more. And for listening to the podcast, you can have 10% off with the code ROOTED10, which is also applicable on the payment plan, which I encourage you to make the most of this month, as it's adjusting as each month moves as we get closer to February. To order Hayley's book or subscribe to her Substack, go to hayleyfrancis.com. All the links are in the show notes. And if you are receiving nourishment from these episodes, please do offer some clicks and stars and reviews and consider becoming a patron.
I'm Hayley Francis. I'm a land that moulded me. gravel and asphalt, concrete and red bricks, but also these huge ash trees. I grew up in a little cul-de-sac in King's Standing in Birmingham, and it wasn't a green base, but they had these massive ash trees that came down. And at the bottom of our garden, in the corner of our garden, was this massive tree that you could climb up, and once you got to the top, you could see right into Birmingham city centre. And the spirit being I want to bring in, I can't, it's undeniably the spider.
Yeah, I've been thinking about you every time I've seen Cobweb threading pieces together. And after you left the land here, this mist fell on the land and all the cobwebs became revealed between everything. And what you had shared really landed with me. And so maybe you can tell this little ceremonial anecdote, because I think people who get it will really get it, and it's beautiful.
What I witnessed was this spider came down in the Charlotte on the thread, and it was really close to my face, and I was so frightened. But we were in ceremony, so I thought the fear was something that I needed to witness. And then I experienced the spider as a being, as a sentient creature. It was moving its legs in the air. You think that spiders just hang and then swing in the wind, but it wasn't swinging in the wind. And all spiders do this thing with their legs in the air. And what it was doing was resting it, journeying through the space, which was a windless space, by putting its legs on. I didn't know it was called the Vedic web at the time until I started telling you the story, and then you said that's a Vedic web. These grids, these lines, these spheres, this web within the atmosphere that we don't witness, that we've lost our sense for, or perhaps isn't available for our senses as human beings to experience. And the spider was using its thread to stay attached to a physical entity that is traveling through the air on the Vedic webs that exist in the atmosphere. And that was a phenomenal thing to see. Poetry for me, it connects everything. It is sort of like a web of words that connects everything and brings the oneness into everything. In its metaphor from one thing to another, it kind of it connects all within it, or what the subject matter of the poem is anyway. But then as the spider kind of was traveling across the Vedic web in front of me, and we were like, with the music, I got into conversation with the spider in its enjoyment of what is this web, like what is this thing that connects us all, and all's connected. But there was something about where the web connects, like the corners of the web, being the experiences that we have, or the people that we meet, or the conversations. And since I've come back, I've seen like 3 spiders pregnant with eggs on their backs. My boys have seen lots of spiders, and I don't know, they've just kind of been around me since I've got back, and I've not had any fear around them at all. Just kind of see them as a comfort, almost like a sign that I'm in the right place.
Makes me think of grandmother spider who wove us all into existence. I mean, there's so many stories of our interconnected, webbed existence, these creation stories, and they make so much sense when you tap into these expanded states where you think, oh, everything really is more connected than we even realize. So I loved that, and it really stayed with me, and I just loved that all the webs illuminated themselves right after you left. There's so many threads. I guess the first piece is I'm super interested in your poetry for therapy, your therapeutic poetry work, both in the sense that it has been a huge self-soothing therapeutic tool personally, it's been something I've loved weaving into intimate, authentic spaces for healing and growth and exploration. And at the same time, poetry is something I think a lot of people wince away from. I kind of picture that spider retreating back into the darkness as something that feels quite constricted and maybe a bit forced or a bit fluffy. So how did poetry find you, and how did you find yourself using it to really access and connect and web together this human experience?
It was never called poetry when I was a kid. Poetry wasn't in our household. I just wrote it as a kid. I used to write little rhymes. And my mum's got a poem that I wrote when I was 6 years old about spring. I've always written. It was never poetry. I loved that something on the surface could mean one thing, but if you just went a bit deeper, it meant something else entirely. But it was just a way for me to express what I couldn't say out loud.
Mm.
That was the beginning of it. But I didn't know anything about poetry therapy until lockdown. When I was considering changing my life, I've always done poetry and spoken word on the side at open mic nights. I've worked in theatres and done a bit of writing, but never. And I've taken it somewhat seriously as a writer, spoken word artist, but I never saw it as a therapeutic thing until lockdown. And I found out you could be a poetry therapist, that there were poetry therapists out there. And I was like, oh my God. It was as if I'd have woken up to all of my experiences with poetry throughout my whole life. Every single time was a form of expression and therapeutic, a way for me to process what was happening to me and have a voice and translate what I felt no one would understand. When I lost my daughter, there were counselling and there were like tea and coffee groups and if you wanted to, you could put yourself forward to be seen by a therapist, but nothing. I hated them. I hated sitting in a room with other parents who lost their children. And it wasn't, they were ran by women, other people who had lost children, babies. And I just it wasn't for me. I wasn't ready for that. It was too fluffy for me. It was too soft, and I didn't grow up in an affectionate household, so it didn't feel comforting to me. But what I did do was write. I didn't stop writing. I mean, within hours of her passing away, I was writing lists of things. Writing was the thing that I needed to do to document what I was going through and document her existence, because it all happened within the hospital. And I needed it to be seen. I needed it. Her birth was really, it was all kind of a secret. And it was my way of just kind of making it real. Did I know that it was therapy at the time? No, it was just an undeniable act. I couldn't not do it. I had to do it. But then like I said, when I found out in lockdown you could be one, it all opened. It all went, everything you've been doing with poetry, your whole life has had a therapeutic outcome. And the most magic has happened because of it at that time. It's been finding its way into consciousness. What the thing with poetry is, Billy Collins who was the poet laureate for America. He says that it's the greatest documentation of the human heart. And that's so true. I think poetry, everybody uses poetry. Everybody uses poetry. Funerals, weddings, birthday cards, special moments, book titles, like the titles of songs, song lyrics. Everybody listens to poetry every day. It's like it's on gravestones. I mean, seriously, poetry is like read into our life. on so many different levels. But what's happened is it's become institutionalized. The way that we're given it is that there's one meaning that you have to find out in order to pass the exam. That poetry has one meaning, one intention that the poet had when writing it, and we have to analyze it and pull it apart in order to find the thing it really means. When actually, all poetry is a way for you to witness yourself, or to witness an emotion that you haven't been able to articulate, or feel a connection with somebody else who's gone through that and been able to write it in this poem so beautifully. Or it can articulate something that you haven't found the words for. And we can't really say what it is. I can't really say what, if you say, what does sadness feel like? Where do you begin? With sadness. That's the only word we have for it. And it doesn't, the sadness, the happiness, the words that we have for emotions are not enough sometimes. Well, all the time, forever. Will never be enough. Despair, blame, humiliation, affirmation, bliss, serenity, reverence, forgiveness, optimism. Got a load here. Why, wisdom, just confidence. What does confidence even mean? If you're not a confidence person, it's this beautiful poem by Raymond Antrobus, I Want the Confidence Of. It literally is like a list of all different things that have confidence. And you're like, oh God, yeah, that is what comfort it gives you. It puts confidence into your body. That's the brilliant thing about poetry. I think that's what makes it an undeniable therapeutic tool. Really.
And I'm picking up, and I see this in you as a person as well, something I think, I don't know your journey with this, but it seems like it's quite innate to you. It's a deeply embodied experience. And what I'm hearing you say that schools tend to do with these exams and these poems at the back of the exam, I'm just laughing because the one English exam I had where I had to really analyse a poem like this, I didn't even realise. So I wrote these 2 essays, came out and was like, oh, that wasn't such a bad exam. They're like, but the poem, I didn't understand it. And I just completely missed a third of that exam. Anyway, it's like they're sucking it out of the heart and trying to just let it inhabit the head and not anywhere else.
Yeah. It's all out of the body into the head. Yeah, completely. But the thing about it's really interesting that you say embodiment. Poetry is form. Okay, it's a body on the page. The first, letters in the first line and the last letters in the last line create this kind of vase, and that's really cliche. And if poets are going to listen to this, they're going to be like, "Oh, Hayley, the first thing I have to say." It's the skin. It's the boundary. It's like our human skin. Yeah. And what you have to do is find the words and find the rhythm and the song in words and pour your emotion into this form, into this sonnet, into this golden shovel, into this haiku. You have to articulate it within the boundaries of the form. It really forces you to witness the thing you need to write about. With therapeutically, I mean, it's grief. I believe it can translate trauma as well, by taking it out of your body and putting it on the page, writing it in a different person, putting it within a metaphor. You can kind of see the trauma as something outside of yourself and witness it from another perspective. What poetry does, it's not like a piece of prose or a story that can go on and on. It has to fit within the boundary of the form.
Gives riverbanks to something rushing that needs to be held without, otherwise it floods. It's just like grief work, isn't it? I obviously know your story a little bit, having spent this intimate week together. You've managed to move through something, a deep trauma, a deep wound, a deep loss, and create those riverbanks for yourself in a society that's not designed to really have riverbanks for that rushing water. And so maybe we can dwell there a little bit because this is huge. And I think a lot of people experience such loss and have such little framework to really allow it to flow. And therefore it just gets suppressed, pushed down, pushed down, pushed down. So these have been your riverbanks, and maybe speak to loss, to that lack of riverbanks in our culture, to the resource within yourself to create those riverbanks with poetry.
I can only go. I mean, the where I want to go is kind of the physicality. I was speaking about this the other day with a friend. The physicality of, of losing somebody, but also giving birth. So you give birth, and our system is not set up to support us as mothers or as family units. Yeah. So your parents are probably still working. If not, they live in another city or another part of the city, which is quite a drive away. So you haven't got that support network, and your siblings are all busy with their lives. But you have maternity full pay 90% for like a month and a half, goes down, and then you get half pay for 8, 9 months. So mothers are forced to either go into work earlier to carry on paying the bills, but then have to make a decision on how much they can work. And then some of that money has to go towards childcare, which is extortionate. But when you give birth and there isn't a baby that comes home with you, none of this exists. There isn't like a grievance maternity pay.
Mm.
You. And afterwards, I was expected to go back to work very quickly. And there was this kind of urgency from my family of when they could say their goodbyes with a funeral. Because she was a baby, and lots, it just takes a bit longer. So the funeral took like a month, 6 weeks or so. What poetry did, I couldn't, everyone else's grief, and everyone was worried about me, but did it in a very passive aggressive way because they weren't able to grieve the way they wanted to grieve because of the systems in which we're living in. So they've got the pressure of having to go to work. They can't be there for me and my partner at the time, in the way that they want to be. So they're grieving that. And they're also grieving me not having this baby or having this baby to live with. But then they want to get it over and done with so that they can carry on with their lives without worrying about having to be in all these places or miss all these things. I could not. It was too much. The grief of I had to hold everyone else's expectations as well as mine. I felt like a burden. The trauma of losing a child and the way that I lost her was really, really horrific. I was in labour for 5 days and she lived for 3. And it was just, it was such a traumatic time. It was really horrific.
Mm.
And you don't really want to share that with anyone, because you don't want to be too much and you don't want to upset them. What I realise now is it was too much for me. And the only thing that I could do to be there for myself was write poetry. The only thing I could do to make her real, write poetry. It just felt like the only thing that I could do. I found a poem for her funeral in Alice in Wonderland, Child of the Pure Unclouded Brow. And that gave me permission. That was like, the joy that I found that poem for her funeral. I remember I was so happy that I'd found this poem for her funeral. But it validated what I'd been doing, which was turning to writing in order to deal with the burden, the confusion, the physical trauma, the loss, like everything. There was so much going on, and the life admin, and then the death and the birth, all of that, like the whole thing. The only way that I could really acknowledge the emotions that I was going through was to write it in poetry. Because poetry is so fragmented as well. Like there's loads of rules, but there really isn't any rules. You can break a line wherever you want to break a line, you know. And the more contemporary we get, the less form there is on the page. You really can do whatever the fuck you like with it. um, and so the limitlessness of that, the freedom of that, was really grounding for me.
Maybe you can read a couple of poems that came through in that moment of forming some kind of riverbank.
So a lot of things happen in the birth. You know, there is a lot of evidence out there to say that we become this gate between worlds. So the book's called Administer the Laughing Gas. I mean, this poem is called Knocking. It's really difficult for me to articulate. But whilst on the laughing gas, I'd found a way to breathe it in, hum a contraction to find a frequency of a humming to ease the contraction. I didn't want any of the painkillers because I needed to feel her and I needed to feel my body. But I'd managed to find a breathing pattern that took me into a meditative state. And this is true. Just before she came, just before she was born out of me. Opening the door was more than a push. On and on and on and on until a tear at the cusp of, I can't take this anymore. On and on and on, hum and hum and hum, knock and knock and knock. Then a light, too white to be blue, shone in a circle on my head, out like a lighthouse, torched across a landscape of faces, miles and miles and miles of faces, waiting, looked to me to bring it on and on and on. I saw the other side in me, humming and knocking, hum and hum and hum, knock and knock and knock, push and push and push, miles and miles and miles until the sun rose, thorny and fighting, and all the faces rejoiced in their first experience of love. I had to get it down. The poem says it, that there were in every single field, it was a person. There wasn't like an inch of the field that wasn't full with a person. And they all faces turned to look at me as if they were waiting for her to be born. And like her birth was their first experience of love. And that was the meditation that I had. And who can I share that with in a conversation? It has to be written like that, I believe. She was more than just her. I was more than just me. We were infinitely connected to everyone. And of course, there's so many millions of people that live on the planet, billions of people that live on the planet. Of course, in the moment I give birth, there are thousands of people having their first experience of something, you know? So there's a real joy there. This one, Petal Lids, oh God, I wanted to document her. She was born with her eyes fused closed. And I was reading this book by a poet called Will Harris called Rendang. In one of the sequence poems in the book was this: I want to call her closed lids buds, because shut they look like petals tucked away, which could at any moment bud. And I was like, oh God, that was her existing in him, in his writings, and he had no idea. And so I use this as a golden shovel. So a golden shovel is when you take a line and the last word within in the poem adds up, all the last words of each line within the poem adds up to the sentence from another person's poem. Terence Hayes did it with Gwendolyn Brooks's poem. Terence Hayes created the golden shovel. But what I wanted to explore this idea, there was something that I hadn't quite figured out, and the poem helped me. I, a conjecture of want, didn't know I'd need her eyes to see my sight until they couldn't open. Call it reflection if you want, but it's self-witness. In her, the daughter's immature mirrors were fused closed. If the veil of her lids were buds, her eyes would have refracted a sense of girlhood, because, as my sun, she would have lit me into rising song. Shut, she never saw her image in mine either. If they who are us not observed in our look, do they live? This book is our gaze. She is present like petals that perennially pierce colour tucked into green and fall when bees take pollen away and crisp to dust before dirt, before earth, and which dry up in the home but stay as a memory that could become an awakening. It's nature's fierce happening at once, arriving and parting, planting and weeding any imperfection to protect the view of each moment and give a thing that needs some air a chance to bud. I didn't know that our children are an opportunity for us to heal. And I have two sons, and our children trigger us. God, we get overstimulated, and you can feel rage and grief and like you're not being seen or heard and ignored, which you would feel as a child. And with my sons, I've been able to kind of really witness where that, oh, what is this feeling that I've got? Because it doesn't suit this environment with me and my son. And it's generally the way I was treated at their age that's been triggered by them now. So I can see me in their eyes, but I would never get to see me in hers as a daughter and be able to heal the mother-daughter bond. And what this book is, I realised once I finished it, was that it's the beginning of me remothering myself as a daughter. Maybe I wouldn't have the awareness of if she was alive. And I didn't know. I just knew there was something about witnessing myself in my sons that I was missing in her, and that's what I needed to understand. And the poem at the end, it's like the petals that pierce colour tucked into green. It's like the circle of life, yeah. Petals that perennially pierce colour tucked into green and fall when bees take pollen away and crisp to dust before dirt, before earth, and which dry up in the home will stay as a memory that could become an awakening. It's nature's fierce happening at once, this kind of arriving and parting, planting and weeding. It's the seasons, it's the cycle, it's the life and the death and the become, and she's the life cycle. She was born, she tried to live and she died, and she's gone back in. But also I have to do a lot of witnessing and grieving and giving birth and witnessing and grieving. And it's just kind of like this cyclical thing. There was such a relief when she passed, and I felt so ashamed of that for a long time. In the immediacy of her afterlife, relief. At least no life of oxygen tanks, and I could sleep without guilt. I may wake to her ending. At last, no life of days hung up on intravenous poles like question mark. No intruding strangers asking that I knew better and could advise as life giver against professions of life savers I had questioned the life out of, on if they thought her alive. I needed to justify myself to myself. There was this sense of, she's at peace. We're at peace. When I walked away from her,
You know, I'm hearing some themes bubble up. Motherhood, of lineage or witnessing, and also shame. And well, I just know that you can articulate some really important things around motherhood and around what it is that we've lost as, you know, one of the gateways, that which we expected and did not receive, that which the soul expected, that original village of support. It's this loss. And I know that you tapped into something really beautiful, really ancestral, and through this grief tending. I'd love to hear you speak about that if you're up for it.
A few years ago, I went to a vintage toy market. And on this stand was all these toys from my childhood. There was a Cindy doll in a white dress, and she was holding this silver purse. Now, I lost this silver purse. I always thought it was Polly Pocket's, but it wasn't. It was Cindy's. I'd forgotten about the Cindy doll. I used this purse. I thought it had Tinkerbell dust in it, and the Tinkerbell dust would enable me to speak to my nan, who had died when I was 4 or 5. When I saw this Cindy doll, when I saw this purse, I was like, oh my God. And then this memory of having all my teddies around in a circle in my bedroom as a kid with this Polly Pocket, with this little purse, sprinkling fairy dust to talk to my nan. That was my grief. That was my initiation to grief tending, okay? If my mum didn't take me to see my nan, on one day, she'd call my mum and be like, where's Hayley? Apparently, I don't have any memories of her really, got like a couple. Apparently, she cherished me. She loved me. She's Irish. She's from Dublin. Her name was Frances. I'm Hayley Frances. And she really, really was a very affectionate, loving woman who loved me. so, so much. And she died of cancer. And my mum, I lost her. This is what I experienced on the retreat when I'd never grieved her going. And the purse, I remember before, it was actually the writing about the purse that made me remember the circle I used to hold my teddy bears. And what I used to do with this purse, it was writing about this purse that I found that I'd known lost before I knew lost, because I lost the purse. And I remember the first thing I did was remember looking for the purse, trying to find this silver purse and feeling so sad that I'd lost it. It wasn't the purse. I was sad because I lost my nan.
Mm.
My mom, I think, or believe, couldn't live up to the love that my nan had given me. She just had a son, my brother, he was poorly. My dad worked away. She really didn't have anyone around her to help take care of me or take care of my brother. She was really poorly in and out of hospital. My brother was really poorly in and out of hospital. And then I don't think that she was given the grief support she needed. She's got a lot of resentment. A lot of things happened when my mum died. We don't even talk about it. But the reason why I talk so personally about my life is because it's the only thing that I can give you as witnessing our grief and witnessing our experience truthfully is the door to the much greater grief, which is, well, I missed that affection throughout my whole childhood. I didn't get that mothering from her. So there was a loss of that, and there was a lot of conflict between me and my mum as I got older. But I don't think she had a chance. She didn't have a chance to grieve, and she couldn't live up to my nan. When I was in ceremony, I came up to the tree and was in conversation with the tree, and the tree for this whole time was telling me to lie down. And I was just in conflict with the tree, which now makes perfect sense, because I've been in conflict with my motherhood, my entire life. When I finally lay down, I mean, I've been crying for the whole ceremony. I was crying. I found my 4-year-old self in my body. I saw her, and she was holding her knees, and I was holding my knees under the tree. And I cried and I cried and I sang in the crying, and she came up into me, and I cried for her losing her nan.
Mm.
And then and that was the final resistance, and the crying for her losing her nan was so good, so big. I had to lie down. I finally went to the tree. All right, I'll lie down then. Then I backed to lie down. I was my nan lying down, reluctantly leaving me, reluctantly letting me go, knowing she was dying. So I was her body lying down, and I watched me. I don't think I saw her. I think it was just my nan's imagination. And then as I did that, I looked up at the tree and experienced Mother Nature reluctantly letting humanity go. And in that moment, felt the whole system of our disrespect and our suppression and our stealing of motherhood that's been going on since they taxed the land.
Mm.
And all of my ancestors, my nan's mom and her 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 mom, all the way back. When we had to sell our daughters, the land. When we let our sons go to war or to conquer or to farm or whatever it is, for whatever reason, to go into work, and then the women being left to the land and to raise the children, but not being respected for that.
Mm.
If we come to the present moment, our mothers are in work, our mothers are too busy for us, or we're losing our mothers to illness. We don't have a mothering system. We don't have doulas that come and help us. We don't have, our friends are too busy. We live in these brick houses. We've been stolen from nature. We've been stolen from it, from each other, in our busyness, in our need to produce, in our need to make money, in our need to pay our mortgages, in the debts that they've created, on the land that they've stolen from us. They've separated us from each other, and we've completely disrespected motherhood as a society.
Mm-hmm.
And as a woman, I wanted to, with the children being born, I was put in that position of feeling like a debt, feeling like a burden to society by having the children and having to negotiate how much time I spend with my children and whether I should send them to nursery and how much money I can make in order to send them to nursery. But then realizing that if I do send them to nursery, I'm giving them a community environment to be raised in that can't happen in my own home or with my friends or with my family. So that's my interpersonal experience of a loss of motherhood, but also my mum's loss of her mum meant that there was a loss of a grandmother within our family on my mum's side. In finally having the space to grieve for the little girl who lost her grandmother, I have embodied and seen the lineage, the ancestral grief.
Mm.
We used to travel. You know, we'd be in a village, we'd be together, we'd use the land for what it could provide, and then we'd be moved on to the next land of abundance. So, because we couldn't reap any more from that. So then we travelled for a bit, or we travelled through seasons. We followed where the abundance was in nature. And then we became settlers because we had to make money because they taxed the land.
Mm-hmm.
But then what happened was when the men were taken away and the women were grieving the loss of their sons, but also being sold into marriages for the abundance of their wombs.
Mm.
So then you've got women who are resentful in loveless marriages, having children, and in the debt of that, passing on that resent and passing on that anger to their children because they didn't have the support they needed to raise their children. And it's just this kind of long lineage of all these stories and all these threads. Gran emigrated from Ireland. Her mum did. There was 11 of them, siblings, that all came over, most of them. One stayed in Ireland. And when I was in ceremony with you, there was this moment where I asked medicine about shame, and its response was pleasure, female pleasure, being the origin of most of the shames, that we experience as women. And then I saw how Catholicism had put that shame within my lineage of women in my life. Losing babies is quite like a common thing, for women. I found out that my nan had lost a twin baby, and her mum had had stillborns. I don't think they were honoured the way that my Mariah's been honoured.
Mm.
Well, I know that they haven't because it only came out, after I lost Mariah. It wasn't something that we knew about in the family. But I also know that certain members of my family had left Ireland to bring back adopted children because having children out of wedlock would mean that they could go into the Magdalene laundries because of it's feeling a deep connection with humanity in that we're all siblings and we're all connected and we're all family. But certain people in my family having to, hide having children, and also the losses of babies that's been kind of suppressed and hidden. The reason why she wasn't hidden my experience of losing her wasn't hidden. It was in the hospital. People knew about it. But I had this sense, this feeling that it was shameful, a secret. That wasn't mine. That's been passed down to me. Then when I started then Magdalene Laundries has come to me at various different points with various different stories. And of course, it would have had an impact on the women in my family feeling a certain amount of shame around having children, giving birth, or being tied in relationships that were loveless in order to not experience the shame of being a mother out of wedlock. And the grief around that, the secrets and the grief around that. And the Magdalene Laundries were terrible places that kept women against their will. And if you had a child in there, they were taken off them and put into homes miles away. So I think there's a lot of child loss that's greater than us physically losing babies. There's a lot of loss of motherhood, being able to call our children our children. I talk about I mean ancestrally. Hiding, especially in Ireland, whose child is whose. Pretending it's your sister's, or pretending you've adopted them in the war, or you know what. And then, but also if you had gone into the laundries, having your child taken off you because you're not married, or being called insane as a reason to take your children off you. And so the loss of autonomy around being a mother as well. So it's not just about losing our connection to Mother Earth, or losing our ability to mother the way that we want to mother, and having that stolen from us. It's happened in so many different ways, but it all boils down to the same experience of a loss of motherhood, a loss of mother nature. Even though it's based in Ireland and the UK, not specific to that one location, just one story of colonising that's happened all over the world.
One thing I recognise within myself when I really access that deep place of real rage at what has been done to mother, to woman, because it's almost like the patriarchy and narratives about the patriarchy and uprising goddess culture and uprising earth-centered cultures, it almost gets like this common language and this common referring and this common sense of like, oh yeah, this awful thing happened and now we're coming back into balance, whatever it is. When we come through the lens of grief tending, it's like, no, can we pause a minute and take stock of the horrors and that are still seeking to be seen and healed in our nervous systems, in our bodies, in this moment in time? Like, this has not been healed yet.
No, it hasn't been healed yet. It hasn't been given a voice yet. I feel like nobody is giving me this stuff. You know, my mum or my nan or anyone in my family has come to me and handed over this rite of passage to do all the grieving on behalf of my ancestors. And actually, it feels really almost, and I don't want to use the word narcissistic, egocentric, that, you know, I'm the breaker of chains. You know, it feels that, but when I say that, that feels cringy and inauthentic, because I haven't chosen this. It's just here. It's just what I'm experiencing. It's what I witness.
I don't think it's egotistical at all. I think it's incredibly humble to say my work of this lifetime is to end that suffering. Because, you know, it's something Nikki shared on an episode when I spoke to her. We were talking about responsibility and showing up in the healing arts and something around, I think, you know, responding to collective griefs like what's happening in Gaza. And she said this piece about flooding, it's not indulgent to show up for this individual piece because it is collective. And one of her mentors had told her the only work you have to do in this lifetime is end the thread of suffering that her mum had endured, which was the response to this productive pressure, this do, react, show up in this way, show up in that way. And so it was this really powerful piece of like, and it's humble, I think, to just be like, okay, this is not easy either, to show up for this tending and this healing for many, many generations behind me. And it comes back into that Indigenous wisdom, 7 generations behind, 7 generations ahead. It's not just, it continues, it ripples forward.
The way I hold my breath is it coming across as denying our mothering because of their suffering. I come from a very strong feminine line that is vocal and powerful and dependable and independent. Like my mum, she's so fierce and doesn't she says doesn't want anything from anyone, doesn't want for one's sake, never asks anything. Yeah. Can do everything on her own. That really gives her a sense of purpose and joy that she can do that. But also it comes with this backbreaking weight, and it's incredibly patriarchal. What I don't want to do is come off as we're not appreciating all the women that came before us. But there has been a passing down of resent and bitterness and jealousy and anger and rage and dysregulation, which only has occurred because women have been expected to do it on their own. In the past the past 100 years or, whatever. In the recent generations, we've just been expected to do it on our own. And I think pre us needing to do it on our own, there's also a lot of denial within our ancestry in order to stay strong, in order to be able to carry on. That we have to appreciate what we've come from. We have to appreciate the hardship that's molded us to be the strength in order to witness it.
Yeah. And in a way, I think poetry, especially in a therapeutic sense, is an honoring. And so, tending to grief is an honoring. It's an honoring of all those who've walked this earth before us, and it's an honoring of our shared human experience. And just in terms of how you're working with poetry, to use spoken word to validate the human experience. And that's ceremony, isn't it?
God, yeah. And the more like I always thought it was about processing and translating emotion. And I've talked about this a lot. And it's about processing grief or processing emotion, going through trauma. And that's, writing it out. It's all in the process. But actually, you're just capturing what's happened really as well. And bringing it into existence. So there's something around capturing the stories of our ancestors, telling the stories of motherhood, telling the stories of the reality of what was stolen from us in our motherhood, telling the reality, being the truth bearers of their experiences and honouring that through the written word, through song, through poetry, through... God, there's this really beautiful book called The Home Child by Liz Berry, who's a Black country writer, and she's written this story about one of her ancestors who were one of the children that went over to Canada, and she went on this pilgrimage to Canada to see where her ancestor had lived and where they'd gone to. Has written this whole beautiful poetry of that journey in the voice of her ancestor. And so I think this work is really important. This pausing, the grief tending is through the expression of the experience, is through saying it, singing it, writing it, listening to it. It's all storytelling, isn't it, really?
And it's this absolutely timeless portal into the collective human heart. You know, when I listen to some folk songs around a fire, it's put far greater things into perspective than listening to some spiritual teachings from a famous guru. You know, it's just hearing the human heart.
Yeah. But also witnessing your own experience in the expression of others. People who are unable to articulate what they've been through or articulate their emotion may find in the reading of others of the same experiences a companion, a way to express themselves through the words of others. This is something that I bring in all of my workshops with all the work I do. It's so simple. And sometimes I think, am I really am I good enough? Because the work is so simple. Essentially, you're prescribing poems for the person's experience, for the person's ancestry, for the person's emotional strife, for the person's location, where they're born, where they live, what poet wrote about that place. You know, you can find poetry and prescribe poetry for any human condition in anyone's life. And you can bring that poetry to them and then say, well, what can you see of yourself in the poem? And then they write what they see of themselves in the poem. And then you say, take a line. And then they take a line and they continue. They write in response to the line. Or you use the poem and you go, okay, we're going to write about your experience in the same way. Get them to write their own version. So there's so many things that you can do it's so simple. That's it, really. That's what the therapy of the poetry is. I think it's the witnessing yourself in the words of others. And that gives you the strength to witness your own because someone else has expressed it already. So that gives you permission to express it yourself.
And when you're working with people, I know you're also involved in a rehabilitation program. What's the experience or the trauma or the grief that really is being transmuted?
It's running away from yourself. It's running away from whatever it is you're running away from. You are essentially the biggest thing that I've experienced working with people in rehabilitation is that they are numbing the negative feelings. Essentially, it's shame. And the substance is a way to be a different person or feel the opposite or escape. It's a way to continue to suppress the reality. What I do is very simple. I'm just introducing them to the concept of emotional awareness. So bringing them back into the physicality of their body, bringing them back into their senses and getting them to think of themselves as something other than the addiction. So we personify addiction. So we make it a being outside and write about it and its effects and its impact and where it comes from and what it wants. And, we say, I hold a funeral for addiction with poetry. Where people write eulogies in poetry for the addiction, and we have a ceremony and we burn the eulogies. But essentially, most of the work I do is about developing awareness around emotions. So we'll look at anger, we'll look at love, we'll look at grief, we'll look at anxiety, we'll look at overthinking, humiliation. What is it that you didn't get to say? Say it, write it. And then what would your heart say if it could speak? What would your blood say if it could speak? I do guided meditation, so we kind of like tune in to our bodies. When they're angry, we write poems about what the anger's impact on their body, viscerally, physically, so they can have an awareness of what it feels like in their body, feel it as a group collectively through listening to everyone else's poem about anger. And then there's a processing that happens as a group, and a kind of awareness of where that anger comes from and how that anger appears within the addiction or without the addiction, and what ways can we soothe it. So the poetry really is kind of is the medium which allows me to do this work with them, with people, getting them to feel the emotions they're running away from and honor them as a group. That's what poetry does in that setting. I tend to bring poems by poets who have experienced addiction or have had family, or poets who've written about their family experiencing addiction. They can trust the writer. So it's also about building trust and being vulnerable together in the safety of poetry.
Beautifully put. Yeah. And I'm a huge fan of these sort of quick being guided into a meditation and then being given 2, 3, maybe 5 minutes to just write quickly, because somehow that's a permission slip for it to be messy and completely random. But then so often it's and then you read it around in that whole circle and it's like, oh wow, I needed you to put words to it like that for me.
I often give a word and then get them all to write, get everybody to write their description without, as if they work for the dictionary. And give them 3 examples in your own life of when you've experienced that. And they're like, God, they're not racking their brains for these memories of these experiences. But then I get everyone to share it in the group. I'm going to go around in a circle. Everyone's just going to quick fire what your definition is in these 3 examples. And that sounds like poetry sometimes.
Yeah, being with someone who's very fluent in English, but it's not his first language, has made me realize that how many words, what does that word mean? How many words I'm just like, oh, I've just embodied it. It's a totally intuitive process, isn't it? When you've grown up with your native language, it's an embodied feeling, and I've never looked it up in the dictionary. And that's so interesting to explore, because then it's back to that embodiment piece, isn't it?
Oh, I love that work.
I think it's so powerful. And I know what it takes to show up to this kind of soul work, and the sacrifice it actually takes on finding a way for it to work financially, finding a way for make it work when this is so needed and this is soul work. So I'm just really honoring your devotion to this path and the medicine you're bringing and the magic you're bringing with that and the depth. Maybe there's a poem that springs to mind for you to offer as a closing piece.
I could read "The earth is a better womb." The earth is a better womb. In the bloody mud, an ovate belly opens. The start of the split, a labour, a crown too great to feed pigs or keep dormant. Then splitting like a headache, pushing and pushing off the loath crisp skull to unwind a spinal cord petiole, uncurling into Tadasana, to reach into a congruence of green hands, to wave out the grave, giving itself space to stretch, stemmed to command the sun, photosynthesize these palms with a stroke of ray, to stretch exilum girth, to make a shade, to make work for chainsaws and man-birds. I bring into my workshop sometimes, it sounds a little cliche, I bring this film of an acorn in a time lapse coming from seed and breaking into this oak tree, and I researched what all those words meant, like. So that is a story of an acorn being broken into life and kind of stretching out of the earth.
I stand tall as the mighty oak on the hill. He whispers wisdom of unshakable boundaries. I am on my knees, begging for the strength to see these stories of the mind unwind, so I can feel what's mine. And I let the light in, 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 let the light, and I let the light in.
Right now, I have this urgency to be a present mother figure in my community. So I'm working with the Birmingham Women's Hospital, the Birmingham Children's Hospital. I'm a poet in residence there at the minute. I work in 2 rehabilitation clinics, and I run a mental health group, and I work, and I've got 2 children. But how I'm showing up in my community at the minute is by being present with the friends and the women around me that need me in their moments of change. And that's just showing up with food, or showing up to watch the children, or showing up to help them pack if they've got to move. Like, I've done quite a lot of mother work with my friends in the past month. I do feel a grief because I think there needs to be more circle holding.
Yeah.
But what's stopping me is a fear of not being able to articulate or communicate that efficiently to get people to come.
Mm.
And that's where I'm at the moment, is how do we access a wider community or get people to come?
Yeah.
I think I just need to show up fearlessly. And if I have nobody, carry on until I have somebody. And then hopefully the somebodies turn into multiple bodies. At the moment, the way that I'm doing it is working within organisations, working within the hospital, working within the rehabilitation clinic, working in places where communities exist that I can go in and deliver this work to.
Yeah.
But that's still so isolate and kept away from the commune. Society drastically needs to change, but the thing that I'm with is the thing that I'm most with is grieving of motherhood and needing to rewild ourselves and connect with ourselves in order to connect and realize we need to be with each other.
Yeah.
So rewilding, I know it means rewilding the land. I know it means being out there and recultivating the land and bringing it back to what it needs to be, and letting it and tending to it the way that nature intends us and requires us to tend to it. But there is we are so far away from that in the city. How can we bridge the gap? We need to rewild ourselves and support the individual in witnessing themselves, and through that, bring us together. That is honouring the wildness of our emotions. That is tending to the reality of our embodied experiences, of our trauma, of our loss, of what has been stolen from us, of what we've been denied, of what we weren't allowed to say, of when we were told to be quiet. In Our expression has been stolen from us, and we are an expression of nature. The way that we tend, the way that we get back to that, the way that we honour that is tending to the wild within us.
Blessed are these tears in the fabric of my being, for they let the light out. Yes, they let the light in. Blessed are these teachings, teaching me to let the light in now. And I let the light, and I let the light in. And I let the light in.
Thank you for being here with the Rooted Healing community. We offer nature-led ceremonial gatherings, legal and safe psychedelic-assisted psilocybin retreats, embodied deep ecology courses, and a growing collection of nourishing resources. Visit rootedhealing.org to learn more. You can also find us on social media, and all the links are in the show notes. There are some wonderful acts of reciprocity and cross-pollination that you can do if you are enjoying this podcast, which will help others heal and connect, inner and outer landscapes. You can subscribe, rate the show 5 stars, leave a review. You can share episodes with your community. Sometimes those podcast recommendations from others have been the most potent medicine I've received in the moment. And you can join our patron community, where you can actively place value in this resource and receive bonus material, book and gift giveaways, meditations, workshops, episode transcripts, community discussion, and discounts to our events. Your monthly contribution helps us cover the costs of running the show, and our hope is to gather enough abundant gifters to really go the extra mile with this podcast. These acts of connection support this work. Thank you. The music in this episode was from Bonnie Medicine and Odro. Both are linked in the show notes. If you would like to gift your music to the Rooted Healing podcast, please do reach out to us. I'm your host, Veronica Stanwell. Thanks for listening.